Hi, welcome to Elephant in the Room. These are short adventures in geography designed to make you think. The idea is, wherever you see this red stamp, I want you to stop and think about what we're doing. Today, we're going to talk about human populations, but this is a long one, covering a whole scheme of work, so don't watch it all at once. Dip in and out and try and make sure you understand all the different bits and pieces. So, population is one of those things that lots of people have very strong opinions about, and it's hardly surprising because sustainability, the question of how humans can carry on, is really our number one issue now. It's also the big driver behind much of what is going on in the world, so it's pretty political and people find it difficult to think clearly about. And that makes it all the more important that we understand how it works. So let's be good geographers and see if we can't find a way to be a bit more objective about what's going on. So I suppose we should start by asking, where is everybody? Well, there's about 1 billion people in the Americas, there's another billion in Africa, there's another billion in Europe, but over half of us, that's 4 billion, are in Asia, mostly in India and China. But these populations aren't just fixed, they're changing all the time. There's birth adding to populations and death taking people away. There's also some migration, with immigration, that's people moving into a population adding some, and emigration, that's people moving out, removing some. So let's look at an example. Here's the UK in 2018. During that year, there were 13 births per 1,000 people in that population, but there were also 11 deaths per 1,000 people. There were 5 immigrations per 1,000 people and 3 emigrations per 1,000 people. So this resulted in a net increase of 4 per 1,000, or a change of just under 0.5%, and half of that was due to the difference between birth and death, and the other half was due to net immigration. Now, every population, every country, has wildly different values for these 4 things, and these values also change from year to year. So these sorts of numbers give you a short-term snapshot, but over the longer term, everyone dies and waves of migration come and go. So the main thing affecting population is the birth rate. That's how many children women have during their lifetime. So imagine we have a woman and she has 6 babies. The blue ones are boys and the pink ones are girls. So she has 3 daughters, and those 3 daughters go on to have 6 babies each as well. So that's 9 granddaughters, and those 9 granddaughters will each go on to have 6 babies too. So that makes 27 great granddaughters. So the population is increasing, and at 6 babies per woman, that's a rapidly growing population. So what if she has 4 babies instead? Well, that means 2 daughters, and they'll each have 4 children. So that makes 4 granddaughters, and those 4 granddaughters will go on to have 4 children each. So that makes 8 great granddaughters. So the population is still increasing, but it's not increasing as fast. So 4 babies per woman is still a growing population. So what if she has 2 babies? Well, that's just 1 daughter who'll go on to have 2 babies too. So that's 1 granddaughter, and she'll go on to have 2 babies too. So that's just 1 great granddaughter. So the population is remaining the same. And at 2 babies per woman, that's a stable population. And that's called replacement. So what if she just has one baby? Well, if it's a boy, then that's that, isn't it? So imagine we've got 4 women and they each have one baby. That will produce 2 daughters and they'll each go on to have one baby. So that means just 1 granddaughter. So you can see that this means a declining population. And at 1 baby per woman, that's a rapidly declining population. And this is called below replacement. Some places in the world have very high birth rates, sometimes as high as 6 babies per woman on average. But those places often have high mortality rates as well. That's death rates. And that death comes from complications during childbirth for mothers, but especially from high child mortality. So this woman might lose one of her babies to poverty. She might lose another to poor water and disease. She might lose another to little basic health care. So instead of having 3 daughters, she might have 2 daughters, and they'll go on to have their children, but they'll lose half their children to the same things. And maybe one of her daughters doesn't make it through one of her childbirths, so she dies too. So pretty soon, a population that looked like it should have been growing at 6 babies per woman is actually growing at maybe more like 3 babies per woman. Once you include famines and conflicts and maybe epidemics, a population might actually be going into decline even though it has a birth rate of about 6 babies per woman. So as a result, a birth rate of about 6 babies per woman can often mean an effective birth rate more like 2 babies per woman. Now this is really sad, but birth rates of about 6 babies per female, with just 2 surviving to have babies of their own, are normal for big, long-lived mammals like us. It's what you find in whales and dolphins, rhinos, hippos, elephants, gorillas, chimpanzees, and orangutans. A female might have about 6 babies over her lifetime, but just 2 of those on average will go on to have babies of their own. And this produces populations that are quite stable. Can you think of any advantages to a reproductive strategy like this? Well, orangutans are a very good example of one of these big, long-lived mammals that have few children. Under normal conditions, a baby orangutan spends the first 8 years of its life with its mum, using their big brains to learn all the complicated stuff that orangutans need to know. And during that time, their mum doesn't have any more children, so this helps to keep mortality to a minimum. But it also severely limits the number of children female orangutans have during their lifetime to just a few. This is what K-selected species do, and it means that their populations grow relatively slowly up to a certain value, K, their carrying capacity, and that's the population that their habitat can support. K-selected species are very good at finding this equilibrium. At K, their effective birth rate is 2 babies per female, in other words, replacement. So in a way, these K-selected species are built for stability. They're built for sustainability. One way that ecologists explain this strategy is by comparing it to an R-selected species or a rate-selected species. These are small, short-lived mammals like mice that have loads of babies and loads of death, and their populations go through enormous boom-bust cycles, risking extinction all the time, but unlike most K-selected species, they can explode when conditions are just right. Now, these big K-selected species with their long lives and stable populations depend on their habitat just like any species. But they're not just passive dependents on that habitat. They also have a profound influence on those habitats. For example, some of the big cornerstone hardwood nut and fruit trees in the forests where they live are only dispersed by orangutans. So orangutans are sometimes called the gardeners of the forest. And all this gardening actively preserves their habitat, keeping conditions just right for sustainable populations of orangutans. So in a way, this focus on stability and sustainability is what K-selected species are all about. It's their superpower. It can also be a disadvantage though. Humans are munching their way through orangutan habitat for palm oil plantations and so on, and this has rapidly reduced the carrying capacity for orangutans. So orangutan populations are falling fast, and they're now on the critically endangered list with extinction just around the corner. And it's really because their natural birth rates are so low that they might not be able to survive this change at all. But hang on, if humans are one of these K-selected species and their effective birth rate is naturally around 2 babies per female, how come there are so many humans? Well, humans evolved in East Africa about 200,000 years ago, and they spread out during the last glaciation. But for much of that time, it seems that their effective birth rate wasn't very different to 2 babies per woman, and their populations probably weren't very different to natural. That's a few 100,000 for different types of specialized ape, to maybe a few million for some species of dolphin or for chimpanzees. But then, when the climate warmed about 12,000 years ago, this opened up new habitat suitable for agriculture, and the human population started to slowly increase. But it wasn't until much more recently, a lot more recently, that the human population really took off, and that's what we're going to look at now. On average, across the world, the effective birth rate until about 1900 was only just above 2 babies per woman. So whilst the global population may have been growing to some extent, it wasn't growing very quickly. But then, after 1900, the effective birth rate suddenly started to increase, reaching a peak of about 2.8 babies per woman in the 1960s and 70s, before falling back to about 2.4 today. And that fairly modest change in effective birth rate set off a massive increase in population, taking us from about 1 billion to 7.7 billion today. We're about 3/4 of the way up this wave at the moment, and the effective birth rate is falling fast, but it's expected that by the time it falls all the way back to 2 babies per woman again in about 80 years, the global population will have peaked at about 10 billion. So over a period of just 200 years or so, the human population has suddenly boomed, and now it's suddenly headed back towards some sort of equilibrium. This sharp step in population is sometimes called the demographic transition model, and it works like this. This is definitely a graph you'll want in your notes if you haven't already got it, so I'd copy it down as we go along. In stage 1, there's high birth rates and high child mortality. This means that although the birth rate is high, high mortality keeps the effective birth rate low. In stage 2, some improvement in conditions or health means that child mortality begins to drop, so the effective birth rate increases. In stage 3, more improvement means that women don't need to have so many babies anymore, so the birth rate starts to drop. In stage 4, there's low birth rates and low child mortality. There's also a stage 5, where the birth rate might drop below replacement, and at that point, if everybody goes there, the global population would begin to fall too. What do you think happened about 1900 to set all this off? What might have tipped humans into stage 2? In reality, different countries go through all this at different times and at different rates. Here's all the countries in the world in 1800, the coloured blobs. The size shows you the population. And at that time, incomes were low and the number of babies per woman was high, but so was child mortality. So this is what stage 1 looks like. Here's the situation in the 1930s, and you can see that incomes in some countries have increased and the babies per woman in those countries has decreased. This is when the European countries, the yellow ones, and America, the bigger green one, went through stage 2 and 3. By the 1950s, lots of countries had entered stage 3. Incomes had increased, populations were growing, birth rates were falling. And here's today. Some countries, the blue African ones, are still growing, still trying to find their way through their demographic transition. But lots of countries now have better incomes and birth rates have fallen so much that in many cases countries' populations are below replacement. So this is stage 4 and 5. And here's the result, a wave of population growth moving through different parts of the world at different times. Okay, whew. Now, before we carry on and investigate some of what's happening with populations now, we're going to have a look at this question of sustainability, the question of our own K-selected superpower. But before that, I think you should pause the video and go and make a cup of tea or something, because otherwise you might not be able to concentrate. And that would be a shame, because this is where things start getting a bit more tricky and a bit more interesting. So pause the video, jump around, go to the loo, whatever, and see you in a minute. Welcome back. So let's have a look at one of the biggest issues we have today. That's whether this huge recent surge in humanity kicked off by the demographic transition model is in any way sustainable. Can we carry on at the level we've got to? Can we cope with the extra growth that's looming over the horizon? What do we need to do to ensure that there's some sort of future for humanity? What is the human carrying capacity anyway? Well, there are different ways to look at it, but one of the most common is the idea that economic, social, and environmental things will have to coexist without compromising each other. The idea is that things are only sustainable for humans where all three intersect and they can all carry on doing what they do indefinitely. Try and think of some good labels for the overlapping areas A, B, and C in this figure. That really helps to make sense of it all. Personally, I'm not too sure about this model. It's got a distinct whiff of what we do now in terms of social and economic being the only possible way forward for humans, which I'm not sure is true. But It's the way that things are often described, and it's certainly a useful way to focus our minds. So what we're going to do is move through each of these elements and try and put some numbers on where we are with sustainability, starting with the environmental. All right, so as a result of extensive surveying by teams of environmental scientists traveling the world with clipboards, we have a pretty good quantitative idea of the natural capacity of the environment to supply us with all the stuff we need: water, food, energy, and so on. This is sometimes expressed in terms of an area of land in a unit called global hectares. And here it is for all the countries in the world. Some countries have lots of area, although not necessarily the most useful quality, while for others it might be the other way round. But this represents the natural capacity of each country. Its natural capital, it's sometimes called. We've also got a good idea of the average demand per person for all those natural resources in each country, and this is sometimes called the ecological footprint per person. Here it is in the same units as before, global hectares. In some countries, average demand is very high, the bigger red ones, like in the US and Canada, Australia, the oil-rich countries, and the UK. While in other countries, the blue ones, like India and many African countries, they have much lower demands per person. To get an idea of the total footprint for each country, we multiply this footprint per person by that country's population. And that looks like this. The red countries here are where the total footprint exceeds the natural capacity, and the size gives you an idea of which countries make the biggest overall ecological demand, also in global hectares. So China, Europe, and the US, with India, despite its low demand per person, not far behind because of its very large population. Even many of the African countries have gone beyond their natural limits. In fact, in terms of overstretching their underlying natural capacity, one of the least environmentally sustainable countries on the planet is the UK. Other countries, the green ones, still have a bit of ecological headroom to play with, like Brazil and Russia, and to some extent Canada and Australia. Now, from all this, we can do some useful sums. Adding up all the natural capacities of all the countries gives us a global capacity of 12.5 billion global hectares. So as far as humans are concerned, that's one Earth. Adding up all the countries' footprints gives us a total global demand of 20 billion global hectares. So that means that at today's consumption rates, we're using up 1.6 Earths. So that's where we are now. And we crossed sustainability, that's one Earth, our environmental carrying capacity, at a population of about 4.8 billion at today's consumption rates. The population is still increasing, and it's due to peak at about 10 billion, so that would be 2.1 Earths at today's consumption rates. And if we undergo any more economic development, it might go even higher. Interestingly, in rich countries, all the green improvements we've made since about 1970 have just been mopped up by more consumption per person, so our footprint per person hasn't changed very much since then. Anyway, the point is we're quite a way above our environmental carrying capacity, and we're headed in the wrong direction. So that's a measure of our environmental sustainability. What about our social sustainability? Well, one thing we can do is look at population pyramids. Here's one for Japan in 1950, when Japan's population was about 83 million. These population pyramids are a kind of histogram which describes the structure of a population. The vertical axis takes you from birth to death, and each of the bars is the number of people in that population in each age group. The blue bars are boys and the pink bars are girls. So what this picture shows us is that at this time in Japan there were lots and lots of babies, and that pointy shape means that the birth rate was well above 2 babies per woman, and this is a rapidly growing population. You can even see a little kink in the boys, reflecting World War II, and that general life expectancy was not nearly as high as it is today. So this is perhaps stage 2 or 3 in the demographic transition model. 20 years later, in 1970, all those babies from the 1950s, the baby boomers they're sometimes called, are now in their 20s, and that the birth rate had fallen as the population moves through stage 4. Overall, the population had grown by about 20 million. 20 years after that, in the 1990s, you can see the children of those born in the 1950s are in their teens, like an echo of their parents. And although the birth rate had fallen, the population is still increasing because all those people born in the 1950s haven't started dying yet. 20 years on, in 2010, the baby boomers are now approaching retirement and their children are now at work, but the birth rate for them has fallen well below replacement. So this is stage 5. So there are relatively small younger generations coming up behind. So this is producing an aging population. By this stage, the population is peaking at about 130 million. We can run this forward to see what effect this below replacement birth rate and its aging population has on the overall population. And as we go on, the population starts falling. And now the baby boomers' children have all retired, but with so few younger people coming up, the population continues to fall and to age, producing this very top-heavy shape, quite different to where we started off. 20 years later, the population is still falling, still dominated by little old ladies, and eventually all the children of the baby boomers have passed on, leaving a much smaller population behind it. So over the course of 150 years, as Japan passes through its stages of the demographic transition model, the population has boomed by about 50 million people, who all soon disappear again due to birth rates below replacement, but leaving behind a slightly more symmetrical population pyramid as the wave subsides. So there was a lot going on in that, but here it is laid out in a simpler way. It shows the structure of the population, and you can see that wave of people passing by. It starts off with Japan going through its population boom. It's stage 2 and 3 of the demographic transition model, and then through stage 4 and 5. And if you telescope it all forward, it suggests that sometime in the 2100s, the population will arrive at its ultimate sustainable shape, with a balanced population structure, a birth rate of 2 babies per woman, and a final stable population around 70 million. So this gives us some idea of what socially sustainable Japan might look like, and a kind of implied carrying capacity from the social point of view. Interestingly, this is still about 4 times higher than Japan's environmental carrying capacity, so that gap indicates the scale of the technological improvements or the reduction in consumption that Japan at least will require to become sustainable. Okay, so what about economic sustainability? Well, as far as economic development goes, there are very close relationships between increasing populations across the world and the growth of their economies. So, as populations go through their various stages of the demographic transition model, those populations grow and get richer and leave absolute poverty behind, transforming themselves from low-income countries to high-income countries as they urbanize, consume more stuff, and increase their environmental footprint per person. The process of economic development is often described like this. This might be another very handy diagram to get down, by the way. Better infrastructure, that's all the stuff that societies use to make their lives easier, like hospitals, schools, roads, and so on, leads to larger, healthier, more skilled workforces, which enables more industry, higher value industry, more international trade, all of which increases people's incomes, which means more tax revenue and more investment, and all this feeds back into improving infrastructure even more. And there's another loop that amplifies this economic cycle even further, and that's that higher incomes lead to more consumption, which leads to more industry, which leads to even higher incomes, and so on. Now, these healthier, better educated workforces have access to all this better infrastructure, and that's what results in the lower child mortality, which produces the population boom and ends up with smaller families, as we know from the demographic transition model, and that enables more education, more women working, more time for work, and which also means larger, healthier, more educated workforces. So this population cycle is part of the economic one, helping to accelerate the economic one as well. So then, let's return to our question. How sustainable is all this? Can this economic cycle just keep on growing? Pause the video and see what you think. Well, in the end, the external environmental limits will start kicking in, won't they? But also, the demographic transition model suggests that after the boom, after the step, population growth slows right down again because people are having fewer and fewer babies. And this puts an internal limit on the ability of these cycles to just keep on growing, because as development proceeds, the population either stabilizes or even goes into decline, as we saw in Japan. So at some point, there are going to be environmental and population limits acting on these economic development cycles. So let's look at that. Here's a plot of all the countries in the world showing their birth rate, their babies per woman, against their income level, a measure of that country's economic output. Like other K-selected species, a sustainable population is one where the birth rate is 2 babies per woman. The global population is set to peak at about 10 billion in just 80 years, and we can calculate how many Earths those 10 billion people living at these income levels would need using the ecological footprint per person data we have, and that gives us this. And a sustainable population is one which is using just one Earth. So there's an area here at about $15 to $30 a day, which is not too far from environmentally and socially sustainable, a sort of human carrying capacity. And this gives us an idea of what level of economic development would be sustainable for 10 billion people with today's technology and at today's consumption rates. So what does $15 to $30 a day mean? Does it mean we're all going to be plunged back into the Stone Age? Should we start laying in supplies to survive some sort of overpopulated environmental catastrophe? Follow the link below this video to the Dollar Street website. It'll show you how people live their standard of living at income levels between $500 and $1,000 a month, which is what $15 to $30 a day is. And then come back afterwards and we can discuss the results. Okay, so I don't know about you, but I was pretty surprised by how high this average sustainable standard of living was. Not far off what we might think of as normal, even in high-income countries like in Europe and in the US. And actually, this is a level that would be familiar to quite a lot of people all over the world now, even in high-income countries. So it looks like we could actually sustainably support about 10 billion people living fairly normal lives like this on one Earth. The main problem we've got seems to be the really large spread between rich and poor. It's that spread that means that some of the really poor populations are still wrestling with absolute poverty, and it implies that it's really the lifestyles of the richer parts of populations that are tipping us beyond sustainability. But we're straying into dangerous political water here, so better get back to populations. All right, now we're armed with all this knowledge about birth rates, the demographic transition model, how it relates to economic development, where we are with sustainability. It's finally time to have a look at what's happening with human populations across the world at the moment. Who knew populations could be so exhausting? But we're getting towards the end. Here are the countries where the population is growing because their effective birth rates are still relatively high. That's above 2 babies per woman. The size of the blobs shows you the net increase in population thanks to all this birth as people added per year. So there's population growth in Nigeria and East Africa, where humans originated, and some in India and Pakistan, and over here in Indonesia and the Philippines. This is called natural growth, and these countries are moving through stages 2 and 3 of the demographic transition model, and their economic development cycles are accelerating along with all that population growth. One big problem with this, if you cast your mind back to the ecological footprint stuff, is that the environmental capacity of all these places is pretty small and already quite badly overstretched. Other parts of the world, often with somewhat higher environmental capacities, are moving into stage 5, where birth rates are below replacement. That's below 2 babies per woman. This includes China, Europe, America, Japan, of course, South Korea, and so on. And these countries are the countries that have aging populations, and they're the countries where natural declines might start to limit further economic development. But populations are also affected by migration between countries, aren't they? So here is net immigration. That's people migrating into these countries from other places. And this shows that some of these countries in stage 5 are managing to attract enough immigration to keep their populations from decline and their economic cycles going around, like the US and the UK, while others like Germany and Japan and Italy don't get enough to compensate, so their populations are now starting to fall. Maybe their pull factors aren't quite strong enough, or their cycles peaked first, or there just isn't enough migration to go round. You can also see lots of immigration of labour into oil-rich countries and into some of the Middle Eastern countries neighbouring the conflict in Syria. And just to complete the picture, here's where all those people are coming from. These are the net emigration countries. So you can see areas of conflict like Syria, that's the big red one in the middle, Libya and Myanmar, where the push factors must be immense, and emigration from emerging countries like India, and also areas where maybe those economic development cycles are beginning to stall a bit, like on the fringes of Europe. So that's the basic picture at the moment. Maybe you can imagine that sudden wave of population growth and economic development spreading out from Europe and America towards the east and the south, and then sloshing backwards a bit by migration as things begin to settle down after their demographic booms. So there are very complex connections between development, environment, wars, trade, and population growth. So what we've been looking at here is one aspect of globalization. All right, so after all that, what do we think is going to happen? Well, the growing parts of the world still have a lot of growing to do. They're predicted to add another 2 billion people onto the global population in the next 80 years. That's just one lifetime. And by the end of that, the global population will have peaked at around 10 billion. After that, maybe the global population will stabilize, and perhaps that's what sustainable will end up meaning for humans. Who knows? But even when global population does stop growing, that's not the end of the story. The vast majority of these extra people will be born in poorer countries with accelerating economic development, but with low environmental capacities that are already overstretched, while the economies in richer countries with their slightly higher environmental capacities but low birth rates slow down. And current rates of migration are far too low to make much difference. So here's a complicated question for you. Will we let the gap between rich and poor countries close, perhaps with lots of progress in environmental technology, for example in solar energy? Or will we try to keep the gap but increase migration to compensate? But I think the very last word should go to orangutans, because they've found their K-selected superpower. If they made economic models, it would be nice to think that they'd be about nuts and fruits and preserving their trees, not some strange abstractions about trade that result in trees being burned down all over the place. It seems that although we're clearly one of these K-selected species too, we're having some trouble finding our K-selected place in the world. Still, orangutans have been doing what they do for 14 million years. The modern world we've been talking about has only been around for 2 or 3 lifetimes. Blimey, well done if you got this far. That was pretty epic, I'll admit. But if you've understood most of what we've done, then you'll be able to figure out fantastic answers to just about any question about populations. Plus, you'll be armed to argue with experts and opinionated people who don't really know what they're talking about. So that's brilliant too. So I have a few interesting follow-up tasks for you, so maybe choose 1 or 2 that take your fancy and have a go. There's one to look at the Gapminder website. It'd be good if you did the Gapminder survey first, because that helps you to understand what Gapminder are all about. There's one to describe the trends in some contrasting countries using all the maps we've been looking at. This one is to use some of what we've learned and to make some predictions about what will happen during your lifetime. And this last one is to explain what came as a surprise to you about human populations and to think about why that was a surprise. So knock yourselves out, but don't forget about orangutans. Thanks for listening, and see you next time.